Hello and welcome back to KRA's The Hub. This is Doug Foresta, and with me is, of course, Maxine Suka, Director of Workforce Operations, Strategic Initiatives. Also joining us today for this special episode in honor of Disability Employment Awareness Month is Patrick Boxall. He is the Executive Vice President and CSO for KRA Corporation. Look forward to a rich conversation. Patrick, Maxine, thanks for letting me join you.
Thanks so much, Doug. Thanks for being here. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about this particular episode. What we wanted to just kind of make sure that everyone was aware of is the month of October. There is a Department of Labor initiative that is primarily focusing on National Disability Employment Awareness Month. We know that there are a lot of local workforce boards around the country that have highlighted and also are moving forward towards supporting this particular DOL effort. And we're really excited, Patrick, to have you on the podcast with us to kind of share some of your perspectives, provide some insight, some valuable takeaways for our listeners. And Doug and I are just gonna, dive right into this conversation. And so let's talk about ending. So the hashtag for National Disability Employment Awareness Month is NDEAM. So ending. So let's talk about that. What should businesses, workforce professionals know about disability inclusion and employment?
Well, first off, hello, everybody. Hello, Doug and Maxine. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to have this opportunity to talk and to talk with the audience about this this topic in particular. As Maxine knows, this is something that I hold very passionately from a personal perspective, having a disability in my family, immediate family, and having the opportunity to kind of bring my two lives together is something that's always of interest to me. The DOL National Disability Awareness Month, it is probably a decade or so old now, 10 or 15 years old, and each year it's an opportunity for businesses and for people in the workforce development industry to bring a focus, shine a spotlight on the challenge of disability employment. Everybody knows that the statistics are really stark. There's a really low level of workforce participation for people with disabilities. There's also a higher unemployment and underemployment rate for those people with disabilities who are in the workforce. And so it's something that is, it's an extraordinary deficit for us as a society and for our economy, and for those who are interested in pursuing stronger support for people in the workforce. There's a lot that businesses and workforce professionals should know, kind of beyond the top level statistics, and that is that there are very concrete ways that we can, as a community, support and grow disability. The level of disability employment within our individual programs, and also as we look across systems as a whole. It is, though, something that doesn't necessarily happen by accident, and it is something that I think demands some level of intentionality to bring to not just shine a spotlight on the challenge, but think through the entire talent pipeline and support process. How can we support people with disabilities finding, keeping, and being successful in employment like we want anybody to? I think it's really telling that this year the theme for NDEM is disability part of the equity equation. I think that's really telling, and it kind of speaks to this particular point in time we have right now, and the fact that there is a high level of intersectionality between disability and many of the other dimensions that we would think about around equity in the workforce, whether it be race, ethnicity, gender identification, and so forth. And there's a high level of intersectionality between disability and those other dimensions.
Patrick,
That's really important.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just before you go on, just for some of our listeners, because I think as you said this, I think what you said is really interesting about the high level of intersectionality. Can you explain a little bit for our listeners who might not be familiar? What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that, we can look at these different dimensions and think about what barriers there are to full inclusion and acceptance in the workforce for different groups and different across different dimensions. When you look at the cross-reference between those groups, it's the impact of disability in combination with other factors really comes into stark relief. And we can look at this in a lot of different realms. I was involved with our local school board here just in a meeting last week where we were talking about the academic outcomes for students with disabilities, and it kind of brought into stark relief that intersectionality, because there were much higher rates of standardized test scores for people without disabilities than with disabilities, and those without disabilities, the rates were not just low across the board, but for Black and Latino and other groups who many times reduced again. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the intersectionality. I think we in the workforce space need to be thinking about intentional ways to engage people with disabilities across the spectrum of the communities that we serve and support.
I think that's a really great start to the conversation here, like especially for our listeners. And Patrick, you mentioned earlier, really intersecting these two worlds of yours, like you're really coming through this lens of living it, and constantly trying to figure out in our particular workforce development industry. You talked about just some of these dimensions, and that's a perfect segue to our next kind of question here is, what are some of the misconceptions that you see around employing individuals with disabilities? And, I think most recently I remembered, as we're raising awareness for this particular effort this month, we know collectively as a system, it really shouldn't be just 1 month that you raise awareness for this particular issue. It really is something that we need to be mindful. You said it earlier, Patrick, we have to be very intentional about how we serve these individuals, and especially those that have particular disabilities. I think I saw an infographic where, they're showing all of these different pictures of individuals that might have a disability that's really visible to the eye, but really, when we're talking about disability and inclusion, acceptance and belonging, especially in the workplace, they can look just like you and me. And so as we talk about some of these misconceptions, if you can just enlighten our listeners about just some of the things that you've directly experienced. I know you sit on multiple boards also outside of our workforce development industry. So tying some of those things in together would be very beneficial.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, Maxine, that not all disability is visible. That is for sure. And I happen to be an advocate. I'm proud to call myself an advocate in the autism community and the neurodiversity community, where job seekers who are autistic can come to there are lots of misconceptions about what they can contribute to to a business or to a community as a whole. And you know, as a fundamental precept, I think, you know, we need to presume competence and presume and have high expectations about what people with disabilities are able to contribute. And I think that's one of the main misconceptions that there is at large, that people with disabilities cannot contribute in an effective way. I think one of the other misconceptions as we think about it in our space is that yeah, it's something I'd like to do, but it's going to cost me too much, or it's going to be too difficult to pull off. And I think intentionality is certainly required. There is effort involved with being intentional around hiring people with disabilities. But it's a myth that this necessarily is something that needs to be expensive or is overly burdensome to you as an employer. And I think the other side of that equation is that there's it's really part of the same thing. There's a lack of understanding about the value that is brought to an organization by incorporating disability into the diversity of an organization, and bringing the particular talents and insights and expectations of people with disabilities to bear on what you're doing as an organization. I think that's oftentimes underestimated. You know, I think that DOL in its communication around NDEAM has some statistics around the benefits that employers see from hiring people with disabilities. You know, higher profits and higher net income, and so on and so forth. And I mean, it speaks to, for me, it's not necessarily causal in hire people with disabilities and you're going to achieve those stronger outcomes. To me, it's more indicative that it's good, well-run organizations that are hiring people with disabilities, and by the way, accomplishing stronger economic growth and stronger economic outcomes. I think that's the lesson that I take away from some of those statistics. And so there are lots of micro macro misconceptions that people have around about how to accomplish this and the results.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, as we take a look a little bit deeper on just as a system, how can we advance employment for individuals with disabilities? What are some of your thoughts around advancing that entire effort? I know that we teed up our listeners before, and we've talked about it in several of our episodes about just what we've done here in San Diego. We know that it does take an entire village, a collaboration of a lot of partners and employers to really be intentional about hiring individuals with disabilities. You've talked about it just earlier, Patrick, with the advancement of a business and just really showcasing the benefits of hiring individuals with disabilities, and not just from a diversified standpoint, inclusion and belonging, but how it really does advance the business moving forward. And we, as a collaborative, I know in San Diego, they're very big on this Jobtoberfest. So it's really another spin on career fairs, really bringing all of these employers that are very intentional about hiring individuals with disabilities. So they're kind of hitting multiple purposes. So they want to raise awareness for why it's beneficial to hire individuals with disabilities. They also want to be able to showcase, hey, I am an employer that does hire persons with disabilities, and this is why. So really having that ecosystem of supports, I know, is really something that we want to be able to push forward. But what are some of your thoughts on advancing employment of individuals with disabilities?
Well, I think for an employer, it's important for them to look at their entire recruitment and onboarding process and think about how that can be improved to build a a system that is going to be more attractive and more impactful in terms of hiring people with disabilities. So that starts from the very first point of how do you source candidates? Where do you find candidates? And how do you collaborate with organizations like local workforce development boards and others to identify candidates that are going to have the skills that you're looking for and connect them with your with the talent needs that you have. I think we're at a unique point here, really coming out of the pandemic and the crunch that employers have been under to find talent. I think has created it's a unique space for employers to rethink where they want to source candidates and what kind of candidates they want to source. And I think there is an opportunity here to really leverage, more opportunity for sourcing candidates with disabilities in an intentional way. I think, from the sourcing, it's how do you go through the onboarding? And Maxine, you've heard me bring this up at KRA events of one way, shape, or form. Is this necessarily the way we want to be screening and interviewing candidates? Are there alternatives? Are we actually assessing candidates against the skills that we're looking to accomplish or looking to fill? In the neurodiversity hiring world, one of the challenges oftentimes is that people have social and communication skills are not necessarily their strong point. It may be an area of growth for candidates. But if that's not part of what the job entails, then why do we have an interview process that hones in not entirely, but largely on what those skills look like? And so I think we do need to rethink kind of what that onboarding process looks like. And related to that, another thing that we can do to advance employment of people with disabilities is to look at job descriptions and make sure this is something that's skill-based, focus on concretely what is required for a position, so that it can be clear how somebody with a disability can fit in and meet that employer's needs. And last, and you brought up belonging, Maxine. That's a really important part of this equation too. And I think that in our discussions with employers, in our workforce development programs, it's almost as important to start with that belonging part of the question as it is to think about the sourcing and the onboarding and the hiring process. Because we know if you don't build a environment, if you don't build a culture that is going to be supportive of people who come with different abilities in the workforce, then all the investment you may want to make in terms of sourcing and so forth is to no end. It's not going to be beneficial over the long term. Over the long term, you need to create an environment that is fosters that sense of belonging and support for people with disabilities in order to make this worthwhile. And by the way, this is my other big soapbox I stand on. I think that many of the changes that would advance employment opportunities for people with disabilities, these are just good business practices. I mean, all these things are just good business practices. And so, having the systems in place to support employees that's good for any employee. That's not just good for somebody with a disability. And so I think there are a lot of universal concepts that the disability employment really bring into focus that employers need to focus on. So
Yeah, Patrick, I just want to interject, and Maxine, I just wanted to interject real quick, because I think you spoke to this piece, and you can agree or disagree with this, Patrick. But just an observation, which is that I think sometimes we think about people with disabilities as other, like someone else, right? We're going to hire these people with disabilities. But the other thing about disability is one never knows as we get older, COVID long haul, mental health, right? I mean, there are lots of ways, right, in which I could be hiring someone with a disability one day, and then I could find myself needing those very accommodations. I guess just kind of reaffirming what you were saying.
Yeah, it's universal. It really is universal. And I think there are related comments to make there. And it's, really the place to start any of these conversations is that phrase, nothing about me without me. And I think it's really important for employers and for workforce development professionals to make sure that there's a seat at the table and leadership from self-advocates around employment, and bringing that experience to bear, which I think dovetails with your point, Doug, about this really is us. It is us we're talking about.
No, I think that's a really great point, putting things back in full circle. It's not just looking at it from a sourcing and recruitment standpoint, but really as a best business practice, and to start with belonging, as an actual firm foundation for any type of business. I think that's really the platform and the lens that businesses, employers should be really looking through. And Patrick, you gave us a lot of great wisdom around just some of the things that employers are able to do, and kind of looking through the lens of just a good business. What would you say would be, just some of your thoughts or just examples, if you have any, around advancing and really taking advantage of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, for all of us to move that needle, for individuals with disabilities primarily, but as you said, just we want to be able to be very well-rounded as employers, and the world of work is currently changing. And so how can we get ahead of the curve and take advantage of opportunities like National Disability Employment Awareness Month to move the needle forward?
Well, lots we can do. I think there are things that we can do within our own organizations. As workforce development professionals, I think there's an opportunity for us to look at our own skill sets and how we do business, and build capacity. Use the occasion of ending to upskill our incumbent workforce. I think it's a way for us to, there's an opportunity here to spotlight with employers who may be in priority sectors for us in a particular community. How does disability employment intersect with what they're trying to accomplish in terms of meeting their talent pipeline? I think it's a great opportunity to showcase the great examples that we see. And there are lots of communities that we're involved with and around the country that use the month to spotlight employers who've really pushed the envelope in terms of this effort. It's not, as you say, it's something that we need to be doing year round. But all of those activities, I think, help to build the build a momentum. And I do think that the momentum is building. I mentioned before, I think employers are under they have more incentive to think about more broadly about where they source candidates and kind of candidates they're bringing into their organizations. And I do think that the pandemic and the changes in the way we work have opened up, not for all people with disabilities, but certainly for some people with disabilities have opened up new avenues for work, through telework and and so on and so forth. I think that's been a change here recently, and I think the goal for Ending is really to, on an annual basis, it's a spark, it's an opportunity to add more fuel, to spark more interest, to add more fuel to this overall effort, and to help continue to build that momentum. I'm a firm believer that in the end it is a culture change. I mentioned at the top here that there are those misconceptions. It's going to cost me too much. It's too much effort. I don't, it's not something that, it doesn't fit with our organization. It's great. It's a great idea, but it doesn't fit with us. I think we got to knock down those misconceptions one by one and truly build up a different perspective on it. I have, outside of my regular job, I do get to support a community-based disability employment program, and we had a candidate recently hired by a local hardware store, and the hardware store just loves this kid. I mean, they've never had such a strong candidate. I mean, he's just great at his job. He's doing work in that retail space, and they said, they came back and said, "Do you have anybody else like this?" I said, "Yeah, no kidding. There's a whole world out there of really talented people." And I think building that kind of culture shift or perception change is really important to spark through through the Disability Employment Awareness Month activities.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Patrick. I think you touched on it earlier when we were really looking at, and you mentioned it, how National Disability Employment Awareness Month is really that spark, not just for employers and businesses, but really for everyone to take a look at what it is that they're doing, whether it's entrepreneurially or whether they own their own organization and business, to really shift and change that culture. I think that's a really great piece of wisdom and golden nugget that our audience can really take away from the conversation that we're having today. And as we circle back and wrap up our conversation here, you were talking about how, this is really something that you live on a daily basis. And as we look at ourselves, we've talked about this numerous times, we are an ecosystem. It's not just workforce development industry. We're really tying in training and education. We're also bringing in the labor market, really, as we look at economic mobility. And you did mention before, you have your sons. We have coworkers, colleagues that might have, individuals that they live with, in their families that identify themselves as persons with disabilities. And so really raising that awareness, making it a culture change and a shift, and really just looking through it through the lens of belonging and inclusion. What would be like your takeaways for the audience through the lens of, living it on a daily basis, coming to work and experiencing that within all of these different functions? What would be some of your words, tips of advice, et cetera, that you would want to leave the audience with?
I'd go back to what I said earlier. I think one thing really important to do is to presume competence, and I think that's across the board. As we work to incorporate and build an opportunity for people with disabilities to belong in the organizations that we run, presuming that they can contribute, and finding that that avenue, I think, is really important to do. Too often, I think, we jump to conclusions, and heck, it's not just about disability, it's about a lot of different dimensions. We jump to conclusions that, no, this person's not going to be a fit. I think the important place to start is to presume that somebody can fit, how do we make that happen? And I think that's that's certainly something that I've learned through my personal journey, and it's something that I do try to bring into everything that we do as an organization at KRA, and think about, yes, we may not have supported this group or facilitated this before, but what can we do to make that happen? I think it's great to have been, and I know you've talked in other settings, Maxine, around some of the great things that we've been involved with as an organization around disability employment, and it's so it's so rewarding for me to see these two worlds come together, and to see clients and that's whether they be workforce boards or social service agencies or what have you, and employers that we work with, to take that step and say, you know what, we've not focused on this before, let's focus on it. I think that's really rewarding. So presume competence.
Love it. That's great. Well, with that, this is a great conversation. I just want to remind our listeners to take this as a call to action as well, to think about all these things that, that Patrick talked about today. So I just want to say that to people, don't just listen to this podcast. Think about how you can implement these things. Maxine, Patrick, thank you for a great conversation on an important topic. Look forward to continuing the conversation at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you so much, Patrick.
No, thank you.